Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Nikos RPG, and this is Game Master's Guide. Today we're going to be talking about what has been the most common topic brought up to me by other game masters, and that is, how do you end a campaign? And we're going to be looking at the best and the worst of these, working gradually until we get to the most difficult of these questions. But as we look at these, we want to make sure that we are trying to build a better story. And that's really what I'm here to do, is help you build your story better, make your sessions the best they can possibly be. Now, before we do that, make sure you go down below and press all the buttons, let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience, and let's get started, shall we?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
We all know that moment of enthusiasm, that moment when things are just going exactly right. We have scheduled the time that we're going to be getting together with our group. We've got a clear, open schedule for that period. There's nothing going to be interfering with that. You, as the game master, have done everything you can do to prepare for the event, and you've gotten together as many dedicated players as is possible, and everyone seems to have everything together, and that campaign launches perfectly. The question becomes, what do we do when it comes to running the adventure in terms of the ending? Now, my title here, of course, is associated, of course, with the line from The Mummy, "The end is only the beginning." The reality is that we are talking about the preparation for the inevitable. Game sessions are transient, are fleeting, and in some cases quite ephemeral. And the idea of being able to determine how long you can continue your campaign going is itself an exercise in awareness. And we're going to be talking about the different ways that campaigns can end, both the good and the bad, and working through the tips and techniques I can recommend that can help you make your games last to their fruition and to close them out successfully. So we'll talk about each one of these in turn. Now, some campaigns run into brick walls right off the get-go. Perhaps you hadn't gotten clear ideas of the scheduling of when the events are going to happen. Maybe you've not been able to figure out what the schedule of your players are, and sometimes those things just adapt and change. We all have occupations, we all have things that we have to do in our lives that prevent us from getting together. And so one of the ways we can start right at the beginning to prepare for the continuation of our campaign through the end is to really look at the concept of schedules and have a very solid understanding of what that is, and perhaps even build in some contingencies. One of the most common conditions that I have dealt with, and one of the tips I can recommend, is when you are building your schedule, build the contingencies. So if a player can only be there alternating weeks, make accommodation for how you can do that in the story. In the case of Nikos RPG, there's a mechanism built into it that allows the persona to remain in the story even when the player isn't there, and therefore it continues to gain the awareness of what's going on in the story so that they don't feel the loss. And furthermore, it allows for those contingencies when a player simply can't make it for a week or 2 weeks or even an extended period, in order to keep the story moving. Now, we have to realize that sometimes life just gets in the way, and the best we can do in those situations is to consider a reschedule Perhaps it's an event that can happen at a later time and can happen for a longer period of time. But the point is that you have to really take into account each step of the scheduling process, from are you going to be able to play? Do you want to play? What are the hours you're going to be available? Are there any possibilities that we'll have breaks in that? We need to kind of be able to plan for that and program for that. And while we have to accept that there will be those times that your campaign will end because simply all of the players are not able to make it any longer, that their schedules and their lives have moved on, you nonetheless have to be able to hold to whatever those mechanical things are that keep you going as a game master. So have contingency plans and alternate days of the week that you might be able to run and things like that in order to avoid this inevitability. Of course, there also could be the dreaded TPK, or what actually tends to happen more likely is that if the adventurers have an objective and an agenda and a plan, and then they've made a mistake and left something behind, or they've lost an item, they are so far down the storyline that they feel that the story is irredeemable. A TPK, the elimination of personas, while it's inescapable, after all, it is just a game, you have to really take into account ways to thread this story. As I mentioned a minute ago, the idea of the enjoined players actually being part of the story even when they are not present does leave an opportunity for there to be a carryover, even if all of the members of a party at the point where they fell, it was a complete total party kill. There may have been one or two players that were not there, and therefore the enjoined persona can carry the story, carry the elements and the truth of what's going on in the story forward, and therefore it's not a complete loss. But most of the time when people talk about their campaign ending on these sour notes, it more than likely is because the story development didn't include such a mechanism. So you may want to consider doing just that. Add a method within the game for the information and the materials that the players are going to depend on to maintain the story are somehow still available even after the horrible conditions of that dreaded event. When an adventure would fall apart on this basis, there is always, although it's not necessarily popular, there is always the potential to retcon the specifics of it, if not to completely ignore or consider it to be a dream or something. Find some way to instead make sure that the mechanism for the continuation of the story is there so the players don't lose heart. The biggest challenge is that once you've had let's say it's a long-standing 3 to 6 month campaign, or even in my case a 6 or 7 year campaign, and things go wrong, there have to be ways for the story to be mitigated, or perhaps the loss is completely ameliorated. It depends on how you want to work it. But the end of the group doesn't have to be based on the end of the characters, because after all, the players are people and the characters are just the personas in the story. Although they may have to take a break. It may even be that a situation where a 1 or 2 week break might be appropriate in order for them to get around or get through the challenges of dealing with that dreaded loss. Now, this is one that my friends in particular have asked me about on several occasions, and that is, what do you do when players stop attending? Either they happen to always be missing on that week, or they are willing to flat out say, I'm not playing any longer. These are places where the game master does need to do some introspection to consider what possibility there is that they themselves may have played a part in the frustration or challenge that the players faced that caused them to quit. But these, of course, are not, I'm not referring in this case to those who had scheduling issues. We've already dealt with that. But this is talking about those players that just say, not interested. One of the best tips I can recommend, one of the things that I do in almost every case, is I attempt to have a debriefing, which is to say, take some time in a private environment on a personal basis to talk to each of your players that is leaving the table and try to suss out what exactly it was that drove them away. Perhaps it's a player versus player internal conflict of which you may not even been aware, or it may be a situation where you've got a player who's intimidating or manipulating or affecting other players, and you as a game master are responsible fundamentally to gather that information and to determine what properly to do to mitigate it or ameliorate it in the future. And I've got one of my very good friends. He's been on the air with me before. Abletop does occasionally have issues with this situation, and almost always the issue with players that are stopping, attending, or quitting has to do with the story having lost its luster for them. Either they are no longer interested in that genre, or perhaps there have been too many interruptions for the players to maintain the coherency in their own minds of what's going on in the story. And it's really a matter of analyzing that data and deciding what needs to be changed, what needs to be altered. I can remember a particular time in my own evolution, and I probably will do an evolution of the Game Master video here pretty soon, but in my own adaptation and evolution over time, that I had developed not necessarily a penchant, but a kind of a fascination with putting stress tests to my groups, to the point where there were, if not TPKs, at least near TPKs. And there have also even been situations where my own personal life interfered with the game because I was bringing my emotion to the table and making it a less than savory experience. And so we have to really take that to heart for a certain amount, but we also have to acknowledge that there are going to be people who simply do not mix with the table or don't find the same things fascinating, or maybe they're too passive to explain exactly what's going on. So it's a matter of trying as best you can to get a handle on it. But the issue is that even if all your players stop, of course, the story doesn't necessarily need to. And so one really big tip I always recommend is make all of your tables open. And by that I mean be able to add new players week over week. If certain players fall out, in order to keep the story going, you've got to keep someone gathering that information from you. If you're a storyteller, you've got to have somebody who's also a player, or many. For example, I've run groups as large as 17 or 20, but I've also run for as few as 2 or 3 when necessary. And being able to adapt to the environment really means also keeping your own wits about you, because a loss of players does not necessarily mean that there's a challenge with the way you're GMing, but there might be. And so therefore analyze it as best you can to determine where your, quote, weak spots are, and try to bolster those parts of the adventures to keep the players coming back week over week. We'll also, one other thing to also consider is the very concept of a retcon. In that case, if there is a player conflict that's causing challenges, then that needs to be talked about in a more open way. And so therefore you do have to look at the possibility of doing more than a session 0, actually having a session 27.5, where you bring people back to the table and say, okay, what is it that is missing? What is it that you're looking for that I'm not providing, so that you get fuel for your own renovation as necessary, uh, even considering the different possibilities of how your adventures begin or what's in the middle of them. The fast and loose rule, really, though, is that the end is never the end. Sure, I've had games where I've had a TPK and the players needed a couple of weeks, and so we took a couple of weeks, and the players that came back were those that had been able to weather it, and there were those that made other plans, and there's all kinds of myriads of things that fall into it. But really, the kernel I would like to have you take away from this episode in particular is that the end is not the end. Your story can continue. It's a matter of fine-tuning and adjusting what pieces there are that are causing there to be a burden in the player's environment, and therefore fix it if you can. A great example is that when I was playing way back, this is in the mid to late 70s, so 75, 76, I was actually running a role-play game for my sister, a couple of friends, and some cousins. And something went sideways, and my players were really concerned about it, and my sister went and actually tattled, which is really, really funny, went and told my parents that I was being horrible to their persona in the game, and that they'd been I was beating them up with the monsters and whatever. And I still remember very clearly my dad, who never played a role-play game until he was in his 70s, came into my room and said, "Jonathan, whatever is going on, fix it. You got to fix it." And so I had to reconstruct the story. Now, to be perfectly candid, there's a game property that I could recommend that if you are having issues, you may want to try playing for a bit to see whether this will help. There's a game called No Thank You Evil, which allows for a safety mechanism if somebody's being triggered and they're not courageous enough to flat out say why. They can simply present their No Thank You Evil token representing that the story's gone someplace they don't want to go, and then you as a game master have to revise from that instance. So it helps to build your experience as a game master, because you're now having to learn how to retcon or readjust on the fly. And the other recommendation I would make is that the idea of fixing it, if you are having any challenges in a games group, the first thing to consider is that it may not be the story at all, but it may be your players are having difficulties or challenges, and you just have to be more open and aware of what's going on in order to help them be able to express what they are having difficulties with. And as I said, the end is never the end. Even if you've completed a chapter and there's a fallout, rewrite the chapter or change the setting. Whatever needs to be done to make the game work better. And if it's not you, if it's not something that you as a game master can do, you've got to learn the old saying that you accept the things that you cannot change the things you can, and develop the wisdom to know the difference. And I don't think there's a die roll for that wisdom check. So it's a matter of really learning the art of communication and the skill of being a storyteller, because ultimately stories are not always going to go the way you want, and there are going to be times when a story ends. I can't tell you how many times it's happened for me. I can tell you that I've had TPKs. I've also had a TPW, and that's a total player walkout. And it wasn't that the players were revolting against playing; they were revolting against some of the people that were at the table. So that may be something that needs to be considered and talked about, and maybe that is really the pearl in all of this. The information that you should gather is that gathering information and communicating, whether at the table or not, is really useful in keeping your games groups going. I want to thank you for having been with me for this episode tonight, and I will be with you again as always Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Also, you may want to also check out my other channel. I just recently started it called Ancient Scrolls, where I'm going to be talking more about the I guess you'd say the overarching philosophies that stem from role playing, and also more information on the very process of regaining your imagination through the Imagination Launchpad. So there's more information for you over at that. I'll put a link for it down below. And if you want to know more about what's going on within the campaign, check out patreon.com/Nikos. I'm presenting there all of the episodes in particular that are the Nikos news articles that I've done over time, so you can get kind of a feel for what's been going on in the campaign over the past 2 or 3 years that this particular iteration has been operating. And until then, thank you again for being here. We'll see you at the next episode. And by the way, as my grandfather used to say, I'm now going to remind you, go play.